They called it the Kettenkrad, half motorcycle, half tank track, and entirely improbable. It was the smallest tracked vehicle Germany ever built for war, designed to glide where trucks sank and horses gave up. A contraption that looked as if a mechanic had fallen asleep halfway through building both. It could tow artillery, carry men, and still manage a respectable 70 kilometers an hour, downhill, with faith. Yet this strange hybrid would prove indispensable, creeping through snow, sand, and swamp alike. A machine so unlikely it could only have been born of desperation and German engineering. When war broke across Europe in 1939, the German army moved fast, faster than anyone else. Blitzkrieg was a word still wet with ink, and the Wehrmacht's planners were already discovering its first contradiction. Speed dies in mud. Every military campaign promised movement. Every battlefield punished it. In Russia, vehicles froze solid by dawn. In North Africa, engines drowned in sand. The motorbike couriers, once the nimble nerve fibres of the German front, were suddenly stranded by terrain. The solution could not be heavier. It had to be cleverer. The Reich's engineers were told to build something light, small, and able to climb a mountain carrying its own weight, and preferably a radio set too. The order went to NSU Motorenwerke in Neckarsulm, a company better known for building motorcycles than miracles. The challenge sounded absurd. A vehicle to fill the space between man and machine, nimble as a bike, stable as a tractor, and capable of towing a field gun if someone asked nicely. It was, in essence, an attempt to make a farm vehicle fashionable. By late 1940, the mountain troops and paratroopers were already pleading for transport that could move supplies up slopes where mules faltered. Their problems were topographical, not tactical. A single artillery round might need 6 men and a rope. The Kettenkrad, if it existed, would do it alone. It also had to be narrow enough to fit inside the Luftwaffe's new transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52, meaning the entire width, tracks, seat and steering column, couldn't exceed a doorway. Every kilogram mattered. The engineers had to deliver traction without bulk, stability without width. At the same time, Germany's road network in the east was little more than a suggestion drawn in mud. Entire battalions vanished in spring thaws. Logistics officers began listing roads by smell. If you could smell earth, you couldn't cross it. Something had to change. Enter the idea of a tracked motorcycle, a machine that could bridge the gap between man and mountain, a device small enough to drive through forest trails, yet capable of dragging a supply trailer or cable reel behind it. It was a contradiction of military design, a vehicle too small for armour, too slow for speed, too fast for tractors, and yet perfect for everything in between. It was as if the German army, drunk on its own momentum, invented a machine to keep up with itself. The result would soon be classified as the Kleines Kettenkraftrad, literally small tracked motorcycle. Officially, it would wear the bureaucratic badge of Sd.Kfz, too. Unofficially, it would become the darling of the mountain troops and signal units, a mechanical mule that refused to stop. What began as an act of necessity was already becoming an act of invention. The Kettenkrad was not built to win battles. It was built so battles could continue. The brief reached NSU Motorenwerke at the height of 1940s industrial optimism, a time when German engineers seemed convinced that mathematics could conquer geography. At the company's Neckarsulm works, draftsmen sketched something that looked like a military doodle, a motorcycle front end grafted onto the tail of a miniature tank. At first glance it was absurd. At second, it was brilliant. The front fork and handlebars allowed a soldier to ride it like a motorbike, while the tracked chassis did the work of a tractor. Steering was hydraulic and mechanical, the front wheel guiding only until the tracks took over. It was an elegant compromise between habit and physics. NSU engineers called it the HK-101, HK for Halbkettenkraftfahrzeug, or half-tracked vehicle. It was not just a code name. It was a description written in frustration. The machine was supposed to fill every logistical hole the army had, from cable laying to towing anti-tank guns, and yet remain small enough to fly. In other words, they were designing a Swiss Army knife with an engine and a bad attitude. The concept was simple: a 3-seat vehicle, one driver in front, and 2 folding passenger seats behind, all perched on a set of compact tracks driven by a 1.5-litre Opel engine, the same as in the Opel Olympia car. This engine, producing around 36 horsepower, gave the Kettenkrad remarkable power for its size, allowing it to climb 24-degree slopes that would make most motorbikes turn theological. Even the steering system showed ingenuity. At low speeds, the front wheel worked as a normal motorcycle would, but as the handlebars turned further, they automatically engaged differential braking on the tracks. One slowed, the other sped up. The result was a machine that could pirouette like a dancer on mud. The vehicle's small profile made it ideal for reconnaissance and for laying telephone or communication cables under fire, a task for which variants like the Sd.Kfz 2-1 were created, complete with large cable reels mounted behind the driver. Another version, the 2-2, handled heavier field cables. Each was built for a precise logistical niche, each demonstrating Germany's obsession with engineering order out of chaos. Its steel tracks had 40 links, each with rubber pads to soften vibration, because even in war, comfort mattered when one's spine doubled as suspension. The Kettenkrad weighed just over 1,200 kilograms, light enough to be lifted by aircraft or hauled into gliders. The army saw it not as a combat vehicle, but as an enabler, a portable traction source for impossible ground, and like many German designs, it was arguably over-engineered. The entire thing was waterproofed so it could ford rivers, even though most soldiers merely used it to haul crates of ammunition or dinner. It was, in a sense, the most German motorcycle ever made, designed to cross Siberia, but used to fetch bread. Still, it embodied a principle that German engineering returned to again and again: mastery of terrain through precision, not brute force. It was the vision of mobility distilled into steel links and practicality. And soon, that vision would be tested not on paper, but in production halls, where theory met hammer and compromise became metal. Inside the NSU Motorenwerke plant in Neckarsulm, sparks fell like orange rain. By 1941, the first production Kettenkrads were emerging from the assembly lines, compact, bristling little creatures of metal and logic. To the men who built them, they looked more like industrial furniture than vehicles. The miracle was that they worked at all. NSU borrowed everything it could from the civilian world to make them affordable. The Opel Olympia engine had already been tested in cars, which meant parts were available and maintenance training could be short. Its 36 horsepower might sound modest, but with a well-tuned gearbox and 4-to-1 reduction drive, it could drag more than its own weight across terrain most tanks hated. Each unit was hand-assembled, a process that took roughly 160 man-hours. The chassis began as a simple steel frame, pressed and riveted, before track bogies and torsion bars were installed. The suspension, a miniature of larger German half-tracks, used overlapping road wheels, a complex but smooth-running system. It was excessive for such a small machine, but NSU had learned a dangerous truth. If you gave German engineers freedom, they'd build a watch when you asked for a clock. Everything was compact. The tracks were just 29 centimeters wide, but fitted with soft rubber inserts to reduce ground pressure, allowing the vehicle to float over sand and snow. The front wheel could be detached when deep mud rendered steering impossible, turning the Kettenkrad into a pure tracked sled. Production required precision welding, and wartime shortages meant every bolt mattered. Germany was already rationing steel by the ton, so each Kettenkrad had to justify its existence in supply ledgers. The army saw it as an investment in terrain. By 1942, the Luftwaffe joined the queue. Their airborne troops demanded vehicles that could be dropped by glider into forward positions. The Kettenkrad, with its folding handlebars and removable front wheel, fit neatly into the DFS 230 glider. When the first trials succeeded, NSU was ordered to increase output. The factory floor echoed with engines being tested, one after another. Each vehicle had to idle for hours before acceptance. Vibrations were measured, brakes adjusted, and the steering differential fine-tuned by hand. In an era obsessed with mass production, the Kettenkrad was essentially bespoke, an artisan's product designed for mechanized war. Meanwhile, the paint shops sprayed the vehicles in the colors of the campaign: Panzer Grey for Europe, Sandgelb for Africa, and eventually camouflage greens for the Eastern Front. Crews often added personal touches, names, symbols, or even makeshift windscreens cut from perspex. Despite its mechanical heart, the Kettenkrad often ended up looking almost domestic, like a cross between a tractor and a toy. Field mechanics were given comprehensive toolkits, and they loved the machine's honesty. You could strip it in an afternoon, repair a track in minutes, and adjust the clutch with gloves on. The Kettenkrad was mechanical transparency made mobile. Everything visible, everything logical. One soldier famously remarked that it was the only German machine that didn't argue back. As production climbed past 8,000 units, the little half-track began to appear in more roles than anyone had planned. It was now both servant and survivor, a practical answer to a logistical nightmare. But its first real test was not on the assembly line, nor in training grounds. It would come on the front lines, where machines were measured not by design, but by endurance. By the time the Kettenkrad reached the front lines, its reputation was already half legend, half curiosity. The soldiers who first received them expected a novelty. What they got was a revelation. The machine's tracks clawed through mud like a determined animal, leaving motorcycles and even trucks spinning helplessly behind. Tests in the field proved its range, over 250 kilometers on a single tank, depending on load and terrain. The Opel engine, familiar to many Wehrmacht mechanics, started reliably even in sub-zero temperatures. Its top speed of 70 kilometers an hour was theoretical, of course. Most drivers found 45 a safer bet, unless they fancied learning to fly without wings. The steering system, once thought overly complex, proved its genius. On soft ground, the front wheel did little more than reassure the driver that something was happening, while the tracks did the thinking. On roads, it handled like a heavy motorcycle. In swamps, it simply ignored gravity. Engineers had worried about cooling, since the engine sat low and forward, half buried in the body. Yet, even in desert heat, the Kettenkrad kept its composure. It was the only German machine that seemed immune to both weather and orders. The Luftwaffe used it to tow aircraft across airfields, its gentle torque perfect for moving delicate planes without jolts. The army used it for cable laying and ammunition transport. The mountain troops loved it most. They could climb gradients that defied horses. Reports from the Caucasus described the vehicles scaling 45-degree slopes, their drivers half terrified, half exhilarated. One division nicknamed theirs Die Bergziege, the mountain goat. It was a fitting title for a machine that made mountain paths look like driveways. In Italy, the Kettenkrad proved indispensable on steep rural tracks. Photographs show them hauling trailers stacked with munitions or wounded soldiers, mud spattered to the driver's helmet. In Russia, they performed courier duties between command posts, gliding over snow that swallowed jeeps whole. Even the field tests revealed its weaknesses. The suspension, fine for soft terrain, shuddered badly on hard roads, shaking bolts loose like teeth from a bad boxer. The narrow seat punished long rides, and drivers joked that it was less a saddle and more a slow negotiation with pain. Yet they trusted it. Unlike tanks, which demanded fuel by the gallon, the Kettenkrad drank sparingly. Unlike motorbikes, it didn't abandon you in mud. Soldiers described it as a mechanical mule, and unlike the biological version, it didn't kick. The machine also had a peculiar psychological effect, a sense of companionship. Crews often gave them names, painted eyes on their front fenders, or scrawled crude slogans on the side panels. In the middle of chaos, the Kettenkrad offered predictability, which, in war, was a luxury. When supply lines collapsed or trucks failed to reach forward units, the Kettenkrad filled the gap. It was the last vehicle moving when all others stopped. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't roar. It just worked. And in wartime Germany, that was a kind of miracle. By 1943, reports from every front agreed. The Kettenkrad wasn't just an experiment. It was essential. What began as a half measure had become a whole solution. But, like every German machine, its moment of triumph would soon be followed by its reckoning. By 1943, the Kettenkrad had done something rare for a German machine. It exceeded expectations. From the deserts of Libya to the forests of Russia, it delivered where everything else had failed. The Wehrmacht now depended on it, quietly, completely, and somewhat grudgingly. Its strengths were obvious. It could tow a 500-kilogram gun, ferry a half-ton load, or drag a field telephone line for miles under shell fire. Yet it was still small enough for a single man to steer through a doorway. For communications units and engineers, it was salvation on tracks. But Germany was learning the limits of its own brilliance. The Kettenkrad's production required too much precision for the speed of war. Each overlapping wheel, each hand-tuned gearbox, each carefully aligned sprocket, all demanded time that the Reich no longer had. The Eastern Front devoured machines faster than factories could replace them. Engines froze, tracks snapped, oil thickened to paste. NSU worked tirelessly to simplify components, but the Kettenkrad's complexity refused to shrink. It was like trying to mass-produce a violin in the middle of an avalanche. Still, the troops fought to keep them running. Mechanics scavenged spare parts from wrecks, improvising bushings out of tin cans and cutting fuel lines from aircraft hoses. Some units even fitted non-standard carburetors just to keep the engines breathing. In North Africa, the Kettenkrad met its own twin in reverse, the barren heat. Engines overheated, rubber tracks baked to brittleness, and dust found its way into everything, even the toolboxes. Yet, captured examples impressed the British, who marvelled that such a tiny machine could pull a 3-ton lorry out of sand. There are photographs of British soldiers posing proudly atop captured Kettenkrads, grinning as if they'd discovered the enemy's sense of humour. They hadn't, just its engineering. In the Caucasus, meanwhile, mountain troops reported astonishing feats, towing 75mm guns up slopes that defeated mules and even light tanks. The narrow chassis allowed it to snake along goat paths where no truck dared follow. It was not fast, but it was unstoppable. Yet the machine's triumphs carried an irony. The Kettenkrad was designed to support blitzkrieg, fast, fluid, and mechanized. But by 1943, the war had slowed to a crawl. Its role shifted from spearhead to lifeline. It ferried ammunition to retreating lines, evacuated the wounded, and hauled messages to headquarters when radios failed. The same machine that symbolized momentum became an emblem of endurance. It was Germany's smallest vehicle, yet it carried the weight of an empire's retreat. By 1944, production had reached over 8,000 units. The Allies bombed the NSU plant, forcing final assembly to move to Stoa in Stettin. Quality slipped, but the design endured. Even in decline, the Kettenkrad refused to quit. Its failure was not mechanical, it was temporal. The war outlasted the world it was built for. As the Reich collapsed, some Kettenkrads were buried, others abandoned. A few were captured intact, their engines still ticking as soldiers fled on foot. Those that survived would soon find themselves working for their former enemies, not in war, but in rebuilding what war had destroyed. When the Allies captured their first Kettenkrads, they didn't destroy them, they tried them, and immediately they kept them. American paratroopers in Normandy were photographed grinning behind the handlebars of one, using it to ferry water and wounded men through cratered lanes. In Sicily, British troops repurposed theirs for supply work in bombed towns, discovering what the Wehrmacht already knew, that this odd little hybrid would go anywhere, do anything, and complain about nothing. It was, arguably, the only German import welcomed without paperwork. The Allies' curiosity wasn't just practical, it was psychological. Here was a machine that embodied the enemy's mindset, ingenuity welded to overthinking. The Kettenkrad was both brilliant and ridiculous, a motorcycle that refused to accept physics as a boundary. American engineers marveled at its balance and reliability. British officers described it as too useful to be German. But its presence also carried a quiet moral echo. Every captured Kettenkrad that now towed Allied equipment was a reminder of how much human effort had been wasted making things for destruction. This small, efficient tool of war could have revolutionized agriculture, forestry, or construction, and after the fighting stopped, it would. In the late stages of the war, Kettenkrads appeared in unexpected places. Some were spotted hauling carts through ruined villages, others delivering ammunition during retreats. German civilians, desperate for transport, commandeered abandoned units. For many, it was their first interaction with the machine. Not as soldiers, but survivors. There were also propaganda implications. Allied footage showing troops driving captured German vehicles became potent symbols of reversal. The invincible machines of the Reich reduced to utility vehicles in Allied hands. The Kettenkrad, designed to conquer terrain, was now fetching water for the victors. Mechanically, it proved remarkably adaptable. American maintenance units found they could repair them easily using captured Opel parts. Some units even experimented with adapting the design for their own use, though production never followed. The Kettenkrad had crossed a line from tool of war to object of fascination. Its silhouette appeared in Allied training manuals, its engineering studied by ordnance departments. It had gone from secret asset to open-source curiosity, and yet, despite its oddity, there was respect. Soldiers admired it the way one admires a rival who refuses to fall. It had been born of necessity, sustained by craftsmanship, and redeemed by utility. Only a German engineer could have built a tracked motorcycle. Only a British or American soldier would have used it to fetch lunch. When the fighting ended, many Kettenkrads were taken home by Allied forces, some to museums, others to farms. A few even found work clearing rubble in post-war Germany, the tracks that once carried war now dragging the wreckage of it away. Thus the Kettenkrad's hidden consequence emerged. It survived not because it was a weapon, but because it wasn't. It was the rarest thing a war ever produced, a machine that outlived its purpose by finding another. When peace came, it was supposed to erase machines like the Kettenkrad, but peace has a habit of borrowing from war. In the ruined towns of post-war Germany, thousands of Kettenkrads were suddenly unemployed. Many had survived the front lines battered but functional, their engines purring amid silence. Farmers saw potential. The German government, desperate to rebuild, authorized their civilian use almost immediately. What had once hauled mortars now hauled manure. It was the only German war machine to be demobilized simply by changing trailers. The NSU factory at Neckarsulm, miraculously still standing, resumed limited production of the Kettenkrad for civilian work. Between 1948 and 1949, roughly 550 new units were built, their olive paint replaced with agricultural green. The vehicles were sold to foresters, vintners, and construction firms that needed small, powerful tractors. In vineyards along the Rhine and Moselle, the little half-track proved perfect for narrow terraces where normal tractors couldn't fit. Its light weight and low centre of gravity made it ideal for hillside farming. Forestry workers used it to drag timber through dense woodland, where even modern machines would still struggle. Yet its resurrection was short-lived. By the mid-1950s, cheaper, purpose-built tractors outpaced it. Civilian Kettenkrads became curiosities, half relic, half workhorse. Some were cannibalized for parts, others left in barns until rediscovered by collectors decades later. In the 1960s, a handful appeared in films, notably in war epics and newsreels, where they stood in for the lost machinery of the Reich. The British and American film industries found them irresistible, compact, photogenic, and conveniently unarmed. As the decades passed, restorers began tracking down surviving models. Their enthusiasm bordered on reverence. Some rebuilt engines from scratch, others 3D scanned components to reproduce spares. Museums across Europe now display them gleaming under halogen light, proof that even in miniature, German engineering could endure like mythology. Today, visitors can see them at the Deutsches Panzer Museum, the Imperial War Museum Duxford, and the Tank Museum in Bovington. Many are still operational. When they start up, the sound is unmistakable, a soft, mechanical whir, halfway between a sewing machine and a chainsaw. Modern enthusiasts adore the Kettenkrad for the same reason wartime soldiers did. It's small, stubborn, and somehow endearing. The larger HK 102 prototype, built late in the war as a possible successor, remains a reminder of what might have been, a bigger, faster version that never reached full production. It sits today as a ghost of an engineering tangent cut short by surrender. And yet, for a machine designed for war, the Kettenkrad has enjoyed an unusually peaceful retirement. It appears in parades, vintage rallies, even reenactments, where it is often the only German vehicle welcomed with applause rather than unease. Few machines have travelled such a strange path, from mountain mule to museum marvel, from instrument of war to collector's toy. In surviving decades of disuse and reinterpretation, the Kettenkrad achieved what its makers never could have planned: longevity through charm. Its final act of service, it seems, is reminding us that invention, even born of war, can outlast destruction, not through glory, but through utility. Some machines are born to make history, others stumble into it by accident. The Kettenkrad belonged firmly to the latter. It wasn't supposed to symbolize anything. It was designed to solve a problem. And yet, decades later, it sits in museums and memory as a symbol of the peculiar genius of wartime engineering, the ability to turn chaos into practicality. Standing beside one today, its proportions seem almost comic. The front wheel looks ornamental, the seat built for someone with the patience of a saint. And yet every component makes sense. The Kettenkrad was never about elegance. It was about persistence. It looked like a joke until you needed it, and then it became the punchline that carried you home. In its lifetime, it did everything asked of it. It climbed, towed, ferried, and fetched. It proved that efficiency wasn't always loud or large. Sometimes it was small, patient, and politely unstoppable. Modern engineers examining the surviving examples often remark on its balance. The track-to-body ratio, weight distribution and steering geometry were all remarkably refined for a 1940s field design. The torsion bar suspension, scaled down from heavier half-tracks, provided stability in terrain where most vehicles simply floundered. This precision raises an irony. The same attention to detail that doomed Germany's war effort also ensured that some of its machines would outlive it. The Kettenkrad's endurance wasn't political, it was mechanical. It existed in a realm beyond ideology, the realm of craftsmanship. It's the kind of machine that makes you forgive its existence, then admire it for still existing. In a broader sense, it reveals something about engineering in extremis. War demands function above all, but occasionally function becomes beauty by accident. The Kettenkrad, like the Schwimmwagen and the Kubelwagen, captured a rare moment when utility became art. Its design philosophy would echo for decades. Post-war small tractors, Arctic snowmobiles, and even early tracked ATVs all borrowed its logic. Compact propulsion, central steering, distributed traction. Modern rescue vehicles in the Alps and scientific crawlers in Antarctica still follow the same principle. Lightweight, wide track, narrow frame. The ghost of the Kettenkrad lingers in their DNA. There's also something quietly human about it. In a war defined by industrial giants, Tigers, Shermans, Spitfires, the Kettenkrad was a reminder that even the smallest machine could matter. It didn't destroy or defend, it endured. It turned the impossible into the merely inconvenient. When historians talk about the machinery of World War II, they speak of tanks and bombers, of weapons and factories. But between all that noise, the Kettenkrad moved quietly, engine ticking, hauling the war's unglamorous necessities: food, fuel, cables, hope. It wasn't built to win a war. It was built so people could keep fighting one. And when the war ended, it just kept helping. So perhaps that's why it still fascinates. The Sd.Kfz is not remembered for its victories, but for its service, an unassuming servant of logistics that somehow became a legend of persistence. In an age obsessed with bigger, faster, louder, the Kettenkrad remains proof that brilliance can be small, steady, and absurdly practical. It is the whisper beneath the roar of the war machine, the sound of an engine that simply refused to stop.